This is an introduction to Vernon Scannell's poem Hide and Seek for students studying the Edexcel certificate in Year 11 at Slough Grammar School. And before we go any further, I just want to draw attention to the picture that I've put on the front here quite deliberately. In terms of setting, the whole idea of the little shed and the garden with it, well, in this case it's lovely flowers, but even here you can see these dark areas, mysterious areas that may or may not be in the garden, are to draw your attention to the importance of setting within this poem as we go through. So whatever we're talking about uses of language or ideas, think all the time about how setting is within the poem. A little bit of a background. Scannell, this is a picture of Scannell, a soldier and a boxer before he was a poet. Wrote many poems about childhood and war, and you might just like to think also here about the way this poem works. This is obviously a poem about childhood, but this idea of war, the idea of, well, experience in war, how might this colour the poem? Have a think about it before you move to the next slide. On this slide you find the poem displayed for you. You've got it in your anthologies. Take time to read it through, have a look before moving on and reaching the analysis section of this discussion. Okay, let's think about this poem properly and begin to think a little bit of depth. What themes can you find in this poem? Just on your first reading, what did you find? I've suggested here childhood, excitement, loneliness, reminiscence. Go through the poem now and annotate your poems to suggest the areas that might relate to these themes. Try and colour code your annotations, and then when you've done this, think for a moment. Which poems have we read already that we could create links with this one in any of the areas outlined earlier? Childhood, excitement, loneliness, and reminiscence. When you've done that, move on. The poem starts. Call out loud. I'm ready, come and find me. The sacks in the tool shed smell like the seaside. We notice a variety of things just by reading out loud. We notice the hard C sounds of that alliteration there, but also the S's that run through the third line there. The sacks, the tool shed smell, seaside. Alliteration doesn't have to make something sound like something. It perhaps draws our attention to ideas. And in this case, let's just think about the third line here. What emotions are set up, not so much by the sacks, but by the seaside? What do children think of in terms of the seaside? You should also at this stage pause and think about the opening, a very strong opening, call out loud, and then direct speech. So, who is speaking? Is there a sense here of a difference between an internal voice and an external voice of, well, the child, presumably? I also want you to think about whether there might be more than one narrator, and this is something that we pick up later in this exercise, and we're thinking about this. More than one character, perhaps somebody looking on, either from adulthood or maybe even just a completely different person. The poem moves on. The salty dark there at the top there, picking up the seaside that we had earlier. But I want you to think now, as you look at this slide, and you can pause when I finish talking, how does the speaker, do you think, feel about being found? What words can you pick out that perhaps give you a sense of how he feels? Not just how he feels perhaps about being found, but also the sense that there might be more than one idea here. Is there danger beginning to appear? The idea of risk, the idea of people prowling. Start to look again then for these contrasts, these idea of excitement or hopes and danger or fears. Notice also that after the initial excitement, maybe, this short line here, the floor is cold, a clear statement that whatever else this is, it's not comfortable. At the moment, no threat, but bear that in mind. Suddenly, the poem moves on. We reach, if you like, the peak. And I wonder, how is tension increased here? By the use of the senses, particularly. in both this slide and the next slide, the senses are highlighted by a very strong negative. Very strong negative. And I've asked you to consider why the word dumb is used. What the implication of that is. It will link with blindness in the next slide. Think about that for a moment. And then, if you're really beginning to push the boat out and we're thinking about excitement and senses, you've often been told don't start sentences, whatever, with and, but here we have one. So why is this and being used? Why is it so effective here? What is the poet trying to create? Your final idea here might be to look at the last line and say, okay, it's a clear structure, isn't it? So how would you describe the structure and the effect of that last line if you had to do so in an exam? Try and write a short sentence about it now, before you move on. As the poem moves on, the senses are still there, but there is possibly here a sense that the emotion is definitely changing from the excitement of the earlier areas of the poem. There's a lot of assonance in this section. See if you can find it. See if you can find which vowels are being used, and then also see if you can say why they're being used. This is something your teachers will ask you to talk about, I think, when you get back into the classroom. Have a look. Think of the sounds rather than just the names, if you like, of the letters. I wonder why these sounds are being used. You also might consider that when we get to this point here, that don't come out just yet, they'll try the lane. There's a sudden change here, isn't there, in terms of intensity perhaps. The idea of an order being given, an imperative. Who is speaking? Is this still the child? Is this the inner voice? Or again, is there somebody else? Think about it. Think about it. Now, boy has not been found. We now enter his mind and his feelings that they must be thinking you're very clever. His inner voice. Getting more puzzled as they search all over. It seems a long time since they went away. Time is obviously passing in this poem. Look back. Can you find any other ideas, other moments where we see time passing? As time passes, something has happened to the setting. What has happened to the setting? What has happened to the boy? We mentioned earlier the fact that the floor was cold. That was it. No comment about it, just that it was a statement of fact. Look now, what's happened? What has happened to the description of the cold at this point? How would you describe that verb? As time moves on, of course, we also see a sense that the seaside is still being referenced, but something now has changed. It's no longer exciting, and I'm drawing sea on my slide because I can, but also just to get you thinking about what it is we're looking at here as we move to the next slide. The climax of this game, the moment where anybody who's ever played hide and seek leaps out going, "Ha ha, I've beaten you," and this is what happens. Push off the sacks, uncurl and stretch. A little triplet there of movement. And then look at the way the punctuation is used in this stanza. Again, you should always be trying to write about punctuation as well as about the words, thinking about the structure of the poem and the form of the poem. And here we have lots to think about. We have the exclamation marks. Why are these great exclamations here given? What's the point of the exclamation mark as opposed to a full stop? 4 of them. What does that suggest about the boy? About his emotion as he emerges? And when you think about that, then think about the immediate effect of the change that comes in these stanzas, these lines rather. The darkening garden watches, note again the assonance there, but the sense of darkness, the sense of stillness and silence. Everything has changed. because time has passed. What's the effect of that? What's the effect of this sudden contrast to the sheer excitement the boy is feeling as he looks round the garden where everything has changed? The last line is the key to this. The last line is the line which we have to give consideration to, this question that ends the poem. Where are they who sought you? Now, there's various ways you might want to interpret this. One interpretation might be something along the lines of, the boy now sets out to find his friends. That's it, simple, straightforward. But how does that line also work if the poet is trying to convey a sense of loneliness, a sense of isolation? Think about that. And then, just as at the beginning I mentioned the fact that call out loud might be the voice of, if you like, a third person, an unidentified, omniscient adult figure watching everything that's happening. Call out loud. Where are they who sought you? Can you see the way those two lines could be made to link, almost as a frame to the whole poem? So that suddenly the urgency of call out loud perhaps has more to do with the boy's fright than the boy's excitement. Think about that for a while, and think about how that might work before you move to the last two slides, where just some simple, straightforward ideas will be dealt with. This slide, reminding you about slime, looking for images. The eye here. Go back into the poem and look for images. We started off by asking you to look at themes and maybe annotate the themes with colour coding. Look now for images. Images perhaps to do with isolation. And remember, isolation isn't only negative. You can choose to be isolated. If you've chosen to be isolated, presumably it's quite positive. I wonder whether you can see any evidence of that in the poem. The poem deals, amongst many things, with hopes and fears of childhood. See whether you can find images associated with that. Light and dark. How does that work? Silence and sound. Again, using the senses all the time. We have with the light and dark, now with the silence and the sound. And go back into your poem and start to annotate for the imagery that you might find within this poem. Before, finally, looking at this idea. What do you think the effect is of the poem being written in a single stanza? Now, the single stanza is interesting. One of the ideas might be, and I would certainly say probably should be, that the single stanza allows us to believe that this is a single passage of time. Nothing interrupts this story between beginning and end, just as it wouldn't in terms of a hide and seek. And it helps to create that. See if you can think of anything else that might be helped in the telling of this story by the fact it is a single stanza. And then consider the fact that this is a single stanza in what's called free verse. Now, free verse, as I'm sure you know, is poetry not without rules, but poetry which doesn't have a defined rhythmic pattern, rhyme scheme, and necessarily distinctive structure. It's not to say that it never has stanzas, it does. But what it does do is free up the poet to place words precisely where he or she wants to, for maximum effect, without worrying whether they fit the rhyme scheme or the rhythmic pattern. Go back into your poem and see if you can find any evidence of words being placed in a line for effect. Doesn't matter that they may not rhyme. They have a strength because they're at the beginning or the end of a line. Ideas that help you to see why free verse is so strong in this poem. You should make some suggestions for yourself which you can bring to the next lesson to start to think about everything that I've outlined in this introduction. That's all this is. It's not intended to explain the poem. It's intended to get you thinking, to get you to start to work independently and to dare to take risks, to make suggestions. Because if you don't take risks, you don't get better. Thanks for listening, and see you soon.